Mason noticed it first as something fleeting, something he could almost have dismissed as his imagination or a temporary change in his wife Amelia's behavior. At the start, it struck him as little more than a slight irritation, something barely perceptible. She began interrupting them in the middle of their usual conversations, and when his phone rang, she sometimes cast an anxious glance over her shoulder before hastily withdrawing to another room. They used to have dinner together almost every evening, a routine sacred to them both, as it gave them a chance to talk about the day, dreams, plans, and upcoming vacations. But lately she had come up with excuses. Meeting a friend, a workout at the gym, a sudden errand that absolutely couldn't wait. He was left alone with the cooked food growing cold as the minutes passed. He tried to convince himself that it was nothing serious, that Amelia might just be going through a stressful period at work. Maybe she had a deadline to meet, or something unspoken that was making her sad. After all, their relationship was stable and had been so for many years. They had jointly created a future of financial security and a sense of mutual respect. Mason remembered so well how, over all those years, he'd seen her as a gentle, warm, and sociable person who always managed to light up a room when she walked in. That was one of the reasons he loved her so deeply for so long. Her charm was irresistible, her spontaneous impulses and zest for life, something he could not do without. But one evening, when he came home from work a bit later than usual, he found the house dark and silent. She wasn't there, and there was no note with an explanation. Admittedly, that had happened before in their relationship, but she had always sent a text or called to say she'd be late. The evening went by, and he tried to reach her without success. Not until the clock passed midnight did she show up, and when he asked where she'd been, he only got a vague answer that she had needed some time to herself and had taken a walk. She mumbled something about feeling upset after an argument at work, and in the heat of the moment, she hadn't wanted to talk to anyone. Mason, who still loved her more than anything, chose not to press her further that night. He figured maybe she didn't dare or didn't have the energy to talk just then, and that they could pick it up the next day. But the next day followed a pattern that confused him even more. She was curt in tone and seemed distracted. When the phone rang, she went quiet, got up, and went into another room to answer. When he asked who it was, she gave no direct reply. She smiled, but he sensed that it was a forced smile. The calls and texts seemed to multiply, and almost every time she hid the phone when he happened to glance her way. It wasn't like Amelia to have secrets, especially not from him. A quiet worry grew in his chest, but he pushed it aside. He didn't believe she was capable of any major betrayal. He reasoned that it was likely just some private issue with a friend that Amelia wasn't ready to share yet. Over the following weeks, however, she grew even more distant. She had always liked to cuddle up next to him on the couch when they watched a movie, but nowadays she preferred to sit in the armchair beside him and hardly seemed to notice what was on the TV screen. She complained of headaches and went to bed early, or stayed up unusually late, saying she couldn't sleep. Mason tried to plan a weekend getaway for the two of them, something they typically enjoyed, only for her to cancel at the last minute with vague explanations. All of this was such a clear change in her personality that he couldn't help feeling anxious. His suspicions grew, even though he didn't want to admit it to himself. Questioning the person he trusted most in the world went against his nature. Still, he tried to quell his worries with rational explanations. Maybe she needed a break. Maybe she was going through an internal crisis or was burned out from work. One late night, when Mason was sitting alone in the living room and Amelia's phone lay unlocked on the table, it pinged. A quick glance at the name on the screen made his heart pound. He didn't recognize the number. It was none of her friends whose names he knew, no colleague he was familiar with. An inner voice told him not to look, that it was an invasion of her privacy, that it was wrong. At the same time, there was a curiosity, perhaps a fear, burning inside him. But before he could decide whether or not to do anything, Amelia walked into the room. She had a stressed look in her eyes, snatched the phone, and left in a hurry. She mumbled something inaudible. That night, they lay silently on opposite sides of the bed. Mason felt as though a chasm was forming between them. In the past, they used to talk about everything, but now the air was thick with silence. Mason forced himself to think that he might be overreacting. Perhaps Amelia had some surprise in store, maybe plans for a party or a trip. He wanted to trust that she wouldn't keep secrets that could hurt him. It went against his entire being to doubt her honesty. He was a man who always put family first, a man who believed in loyalty and transparency between spouses. Even though he was calm by nature, the whole situation was starting to wear him down from within. Every day, he went to work with a knot in his stomach, and every evening he came home with the same knot. Not knowing where he stood, not knowing whether he should try to reach out to her or back off, was an emotional torment. But then came the evening when he could no longer ignore the signs. For the third time that week, Amelia came home much later than usual and also offered an explanation that didn't sound plausible. She claimed she'd been with a friend, but when Mason gently asked him, she looked away and gave some evasive reply. That nagging feeling he'd been trying to suppress finally burst. He still wasn't sure what he would find, or if what he suspected was even true, but it was as though he was compelled to investigate. His logical side told him it was best to seek the truth, no matter how painful it might be, because uncertainty and suspicion could destroy him more than the truth itself. He was tired of constantly making excuses in his own head, of trying to justify Amelia's changed behavior. When he first went through her phone that night, he found nothing conclusive. Amelia seemed to have deleted conversations and call histories to a degree he wasn't used to. She wasn't normally so thorough about clearing her phone, and that in itself was suspicious. That's when he remembered her laptop, a relatively new purchase, which was often connected with the same messaging apps. They had talked about how she wanted to be able to read her messages on a bigger screen. He felt a tight ball of anxiety in his stomach as he logged onto her computer, because he knew that if he found anything, it would shake his life to the core. Yet there was a dark, nervous curiosity driving him. Sure enough, the messaging app was installed and logged in. He swallowed hard and clicked inside, heart pounding in his chest. What he saw made his vision go dark. There were conversations with a man who called himself Nathan, a man Mason had never heard of. At first, the messages seemed fairly innocent, but they quickly turned flirtatious, intimate in their wording, and finally explicit in both text and pictures. It was obvious that Amelia had gone far beyond mere friendly conversation. Nathan's tone was confident, and Amelia's replies were close and familiar. She expressed longing, yearning, frustration at not being able to see him openly. She wrote that she felt alive, that he clearly gave her something she didn't have in her marriage. The pictures were personal, selfies taken in settings Mason recognized. Their bathroom, their bedroom, hotel rooms with beds he didn't recognize. He realized she'd gone behind his back in a very real way. The words on the screen blurred before his eyes, and he felt as though the world stopped spinning. Everything he believed to be stable in his life lost its foundation in one horrible instant. He read line after line, scrolling in silent desperation, his eyes stinging. The oxygen seemed to drain from the room. This wasn't just a one-time lapse in judgment. There were details revealing it had been going on for a while. He read about secret meetings, hotel bookings, lunches, and get-togethers at different places. She even wrote about her feelings for Nathan in a way that made Mason sick to his stomach. He felt betrayed and unclean, as though everything in his marriage had been stained by lies. The messages came at all hours, showing how deeply she was ensnared in this. Finally, he closed the computer so she wouldn't catch him reading her conversations if she came home, but the damage was done. Inside, he was in turmoil. He was disappointed that she could be so ruthless, and he was furious that she had lied straight to his face so many times. But most of all, he felt sad. Sad that their shared life was no longer what he had believed. That night he sat up late, unable to sleep, hearing Amelia come home and tiptoe into the bedroom. He stayed shut in the office on the first floor. He didn't need an explanation anymore. He had already seen the truth with his own eyes. That night was a turning point, a black hole in his otherwise balanced existence. In the morning, when Amelia woke up, he pretended that nothing was amiss. He was afraid that if he confronted her right away, he would explode. He needed to sort out his own feelings and his future before he sat with her at the kitchen table and laid bare all his pain and anger. And so he began planning. There was no going back. He was convinced of that. For many years, he had loved Amelia unconditionally, but this kind of betrayal was not something he could easily forgive. He realized he could choose to stay, but it would destroy him if he constantly had to wonder where she went, whom she met, whether she was lying to him again. He didn't want to live that way. He didn't want to be the kind of man who constantly looked for proof in his wife's phone. He needed a way out. Maybe he would lose everything he'd built. Maybe he'd feel lonely. But loneliness was still better than always walking on eggshells. He thought through the consequences, how a divorce would affect their finances, their joint assets, their friends, their families. Everything would be turned upside down. Yet the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that he couldn't stay in something that was already dead. He gathered his courage and called a lawyer a colleague had recommended. He began the call with a deep breath, then shared his story, or parts of it, with the lawyer. They discussed what documents he'd need, how the process worked, and what rights he had. It was a cold, practical conversation that made him feel like he was already moving away from Amelia, but at the same time it gave him a strange sense of relief. The very moment he took the step of asking for legal advice, it felt as though he was regaining some control over his own life. He no longer had to drift in limbo and put up with being deceived. He could make an active choice. Quietly, he continued gathering information, sending it to the lawyer to prepare the divorce papers. During the day, he went to work as usual, but in his mind, he kept circling the question of where he would live. He started looking for an apartment. Nothing too big, but comfortable enough for him to begin a new life. Part of him felt foolish taking these steps before even confronting Amelia with the evidence, but another part realized he needed to be prepared for her reaction. Once he laid his cards on the table, everything might collapse, and then he didn't want to be left helpless. Perhaps she would deny everything. Perhaps she would admit it and cry. He didn't know how she would react. He no longer knew her. He realized more and more each day. Who was this Amelia who wrote such passionate, deceitful words to another man? Who was she who betrayed him over and over? It was as though he was living with a stranger. Then came the moment when he could no longer keep the truth to himself. He had everything: screenshots, saved conversations, bank statements showing hotel bookings and payments that couldn't be explained otherwise. His heart pounded violently one evening when he asked Amelia to sit down on the couch. She could already tell something was wrong. Perhaps she feared the worst. She wondered why he was so serious. Mason took a deep breath and told her what he knew. He showed her pictures, sent them to her phone, so she could see he wasn't making things up. He explained that he had read her conversations with Nathan, that he had seen proof of their affair. He said he could no longer ignore how she behaved. Amelia initially tried to squirm out of it, but the written evidence was damning. She couldn't pretend nothing had happened. It was as if time and space ceased to exist at that moment. Amelia put her hands over her face and then broke down. She blurted out explanations, excuses, denials, all in a chaotic mess. She yelled that she hadn't meant to hurt him, that it wasn't what he thought, that he had forced her into a corner by working too much, that she'd felt lonely, that she just wanted attention. Mason felt the anger boiling inside him. He asked why she hadn't told him sooner, why she hadn't just said that she felt neglected. He explained that he had never had any inkling that she was so unhappy she would start an affair, and that if she'd only told him how she felt, he would have tried to change his routines, reduce his work hours, anything to save their marriage. But now she hadn't just failed to communicate. She had taken active steps to deceive him. She fell to her knees in front of him, sobbing, begging that she not lose him, swearing she loved him and that it was a huge mistake. She blamed it on the heat of the moment, on the allure of excitement. She claimed their life had become too predictable, that she felt stifled and overlooked, but that she hadn't known how to bring it up with him. In her obvious desperation, there was a certain honesty. It was clear she regretted it. But for Mason, it was also obvious how badly their relationship was broken. He had devoted himself to building a stable life with her, and she had secretly created another relationship behind his back while still pretending everything was fine. After confronting her, there was a part of him that still clung to the vows he had once made to Amelia. He had vowed always to be there for her, in sickness and in health, that he wouldn't abandon her no matter how stormy it got. He had taken those promises very seriously. He had intended to share life with her into old age. Despite his anger and disappointment, he wasn't ready to slam the door completely, at least not at that exact moment. So when she tearfully begged for another chance, promising she'd do anything to make it up to him, he couldn't ignore his sense of duty and love. He actually considered trying to fix what was broken. It wasn't a simple or logical feeling, but something deeply rooted in who he was as a person. Yet to think clearly and figure out what he truly wanted, he realized he needed distance. She was too close with her grief and desperation, appealing to his compassion every moment. He asked her to give him space. He said he would stay in a hotel or arrange a temporary solution. But in the end, he decided to move into an apartment he had already found. It wasn't a palace, but it was a private space where he could collect himself. Amelia protested, cried, and begged him not to leave her alone. She offered to move out instead, but he felt he was the one who needed to break from their shared home in order to think. He packed a bag and left her one evening when the air was thick with tension and tears. Day after day, Amelia bombarded him with texts, calls, and voice messages. She begged him to come home. She wrote long messages about how she couldn't eat or sleep, how her life was meaningless without him. She promised the affair was over, that she'd cut off all contact with Nathan. She was willing to go to couples therapy, to change jobs if necessary, anything to make things right. Mason read these messages but replied only sparingly. He needed time to heal, and honestly, he needed to figure out whether he could ever trust her again. He was tormented by images of the messages and photos he had seen. He was tormented by the thought of how Amelia had lied to his face so many times. At the same time, he remembered the kind, open woman he had once married and wondered how everything could have gone so wrong. After a few days, once he felt he had at least gotten some breathing room to think, he let Amelia know he would come home to talk. He didn't know whether they could solve anything, but he wanted to sit down and discuss the terms of a possible future together, to see if any kind of reconciliation was even possible. With a mixture of nervousness and hope, he walked into the house they had once called their safe haven. Inside the hallway, the silence struck him as peculiar. He called Amelia's name, but got no answer. He walked toward the bedroom. The door was half closed. He had no idea what to expect, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw when he opened the door. Amelia was lying in bed, and beside her was Nathan. Their eyes flew open in panic when they heard him enter. Everything froze in Mason. He could hardly believe his own eyes. After she had asked for forgiveness, promised it was over, bombarded him with messages pleading for another chance, he now found her in their marital bed with the very man she had previously been cheating with. There was no defense, no remaining doubt. Amelia jumped out of bed, stood in front of him, and began spewing words in panic, excuses he could hardly understand. Nathan scrambled to pull on his clothes, mumbling something but going silent when he met Mason's stare. Mason himself felt a bizarre mix of rage and icy resignation. He realized in that moment there was nothing left to save. All the love he had once felt did not vanish that instant, but the trust in Amelia, the belief that she genuinely regretted her actions, was gone. It was as though he slammed the door on their shared past at the same time. Without saying much, he turned on his heel and walked out of the house. Amelia ran after him, wearing only a robe, calling his name, begging him to listen, insisting it wasn't what it looked like, that she needed him. But he was beyond caring. She had hurt him once, but the fact that after professing her remorse, she was still with the same man in the same bed was a betrayal of such magnitude that he could hardly process it. He jumped into his car and drove off, feeling his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the wheel. His future was now in his own hands. He would divorce her. There was no turning back. Before long, he began the process. His lawyer had already prepared much of the paperwork. Amelia's incessant calls did nothing to change that. Her countless texts claiming she had been caught off guard by Nathan changed nothing. In his eyes, she was no longer his wife, no longer his friend or confidant. He didn't believe a single word that came out of her mouth. Once the paperwork was ready, he marched resolutely to the courthouse and filed for divorce. It felt both terrible and liberating. He didn't cry. The anger and grief had dried his tear ducts. He felt an empty numbness. At the same time, it was a relief. Now there was a path forward, however lonely. The lawyer went through their joint assets, the house they owned together, the cars, the savings account, the insurance policies. Mason was systematic. He didn't want to crush Amelia financially, but saw no reason to give her more than what was legally hers. He didn't know what she would do or how she would manage, but he could no longer be responsible for her life. She had obviously made a choice. She wanted excitement and adventure instead of a stable, loyal husband. Now she would have to face the consequences. Soon rumors began circulating among friends, family, and acquaintances. Early on, Amelia claimed that Mason had left her, that he'd been cold and distant. But the truth quickly surfaced. People aren't as naive as Amelia had hoped. Once everyone found out the reason he filed for divorce, many realized she had been incredibly selfish and deceitful. Those who once admired her charm and spontaneity now saw a completely different side. They turned cold toward her. Moreover, when she tried to hang on to Nathan, she found he wasn't nearly as interested once Mason actually went through with the divorce. Nathan slowly withdrew, stopped taking her calls as often, maybe because he wasn't prepared for the responsibility of being with a newly divorced woman who'd lost some of her stability. Soon Amelia was left alone, without either a husband or a lover. Sometimes she reached out to Mason, trying to get him to change his mind, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Time went by, and Mason actually felt relieved, although he was still sometimes overwhelmed by sadness when he recalled their happier days. He worked through the sorrow of a marriage that had collapsed, but he also felt empowered by having chosen a life free from lies. He focused on his job and spent more time with close friends who supported him. Some friends wondered why Amelia had ruined an apparently perfect marriage, but it was no longer Mason's burden to bear. He learned to accept that some people crave excitement and attention in a way that can't coexist with a faithful relationship. During the course of the divorce, Amelia sometimes tried to delay things. She insisted she hadn't had time to find a place to live, that she was financially vulnerable. She hoped to make him relent, but he stood firm. He gave her whatever she was legally entitled to, but no more. He could no longer be swayed by her tears. She had burned that bridge with her betrayals. In a way, he was surprised by his own coolness, because he used to be a very empathetic person who was always ready to help her. But he felt he needed to protect himself. She had already taken too much of his emotional energy, shattered his trust. Now he deserved to be strong, even if it made him appear cold in her eyes. Once the divorce was finalized, she was left without the man who had supported her for so many years, building a secure life with her. Most of their friends sided with Mason out of loyalty to him. Amelia ended up quite alone, without love from either Nathan or anyone else. Her work performance declined because she was mentally absent, no longer able to be the cheerful, charming person who used to radiate energy. People gossiped about how she had behaved, how she had secretly acted, and she felt the social chill grow day by day. The excitement she had once sought, that was now gone. In its place were the consequences of infidelity and betrayal. Meanwhile, Mason gradually began to put his new life in order. The apartment was simple but cozy, and he realized he was happier living on his own than wandering around a house that reminded him of Amelia's betrayal. He focused on work, began exercising, and resumed hobbies he'd neglected while married. With some astonishment, he realized he no longer had to worry about who Amelia was texting or where she was. There was freedom in being alone when the alternative was being tied to someone who repeatedly shattered his trust. He could feel sadness about what had happened, but sometimes sadness is paired with relief. Sometime after the divorce, when things had settled somewhat, he received a letter from Amelia. She wrote that she realized her mistake, that she was desperate for another chance. She apologized in every way she could. She wrote about how she hadn't understood the security he provided, how she'd taken for granted what they'd built together because she longed for a thrilling sense of novelty and affirmation from someone else. She admitted to having behaved terribly, and she asked him to think back to their happy memories, to remember how they had always been a strong team. She pleaded with him to consider giving them a fresh start. Mason set the letter aside without feeling anything other than a quiet sadness. It was too late. Had he received such a letter before coming home to find her in bed with Nathan, he might have considered giving their relationship one last chance. But she had burned the bridge that connected them, leaving nothing to build upon. He didn't reply. He no longer needed an explanation or an apology. The lies had already been exposed, and the time for honesty had long passed. During the ensuing period, Mason learned more about himself. He realized that, despite everything she had done, he didn't wish Amelia ill. He simply wanted to forget and move on. But there was no escaping the fact that she had tasted the consequences of her behavior. She was alone, financially insecure, and had gained a reputation she would likely struggle to shake off. Her new relationship had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Perhaps it was never meant to last. Perhaps it was just a lure that was thrilling as long as no one had to face the real-life consequences. Now that her actions had led to a divorce and real changes to her life, it was obvious Nathan wasn't going to solve her problems. So she was left with the emptiness of losing Mason and the emptiness of losing that brief passion, with no security other than herself. On the nights Mason lay awake, he could feel a slight compassion for her. But he no longer cried. He no longer blamed himself, either. He knew he had done his best to build the strongest marriage he could, and he would have done anything for her if she had only told him how she felt. He revisited their history in his mind, from the first sparks of love to the day he came home and found her in their bed with another man. It was painful to realize that his own wife could destroy so much for both of them. At the same time, he was certain it was entirely on her. No one had forced her to cheat. He took his work seriously to ensure their shared future, but she chose a different path. After the fact, his friends told him Amelia was complaining about how unfair everything was, but most people couldn't empathize with her. They thought she had deliberately destroyed a functioning relationship and then lied to Mason's face. It was hard for her to find sympathy from anyone in their circle. Their mutual friends, in general, were loyal to Mason, having seen how dedicated he was as a husband, how he always put Amelia and her well-being first. The way she betrayed him seemed unforgivable to many. Those who still spent time with Amelia did so with a degree of tension, because any mention of Mason or the divorce led her to either break down in tears or lash out in frustration. Little by little, Mason's daily life returned to a semblance of calm. Yes, he sometimes missed having a partner by his side, but he knew time would heal those wounds. Being alone was better than being caught up in a relationship full of chaos. He started reading books in the evenings, put more energy into developing his career, something he might have neglected, and above all realized he was at his core the same stable, calm person he'd always been. Now he didn't have to adapt to someone who wasn't open or honest about her needs. He gradually started spending time with colleagues and friends in new settings, emerging from the darkness that had initially threatened to swallow him after discovering Amelia's unfaithfulness. When he looked back on their marriage, the past felt like a distant dream. Memories of the wedding day, the honeymoon, moments of closeness when they sat on the couch making plans for the future. He could recall those times with a kind of bittersweet sense, as though they belonged to someone else. It was a sad happiness for what had once been good and a deep sorrow for how it had ended. Yet he didn't regret his decision. Continuing in a lie would have been worse than breaking things off. He could look to the future and see a chance to start over, maybe eventually meet someone else who would prove honest and faithful. In the weeks that followed, the practical details of the property division were concluded. The house was sold, and the proceeds were split. Mason used his share of the profit to get a slightly bigger place, somewhere he could actually settle down if he wished, a fresh start. Amelia left town for a while, according to what Mason heard through mutual acquaintances. Clearly, it was difficult for her to remain where everyone knew her story, where most people felt sympathy for Mason and skepticism toward her. Nobody knew exactly where she went. Mason felt no need to find out. That chapter of his life was finished. The thought of her last desperate attempt to hold on to him, that letter she wrote, still lingered in Mason's mind as a reminder of how she must regret her behavior. She had apologized in the depths of her despair, but he guessed it was also guilt over having ruined their life. Maybe she regretted not talking to him before seeking affirmation with someone else. Maybe she realized now that Nathan had never been more than a fantasy, thrilling as long as nothing became too real. But her regret came too late, and to Mason it wasn't particularly believable, given what he saw in their bedroom. He didn't trust that she was truly finished with her betrayal, because she had obviously continued even after swearing she was sincerely remorseful. Still, on some nights he lay awake wondering how he could have missed the signs. Perhaps he had been too naive, too caught up in work, too certain of her loyalty. He mulled over his own role. Had he failed as a husband? Should he have been more attentive to her signals, devoted more time and emotional support? But then he also remembered that every relationship has its ups and downs, and in a healthy relationship you talk about problems, trying to solve them together. You don't risk everything by secretly starting a new relationship. Eventually, he let go of the guilt. He realized she had made a choice, regardless of whatever flaws he might have. She had chosen to be unfaithful and lie. That wasn't his fault. Once the guilt finally lifted, he was able to move on and find a sense of normalcy.
If you liked this story, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up. It helps a lot, and you won't miss out on any future stories. Take care and live your best life.